right. Well, I'm not going to take a break today because I want to sort of speed us through, and there's a valley just before our house that floods when it's, so I'm like, oh, if I wait too long, I might not be able to get home, because normally we bring the truck on days like this. But I also confess I'm worried about the cat, that she might be drowning because she's outdoors. Oh, all right. But if you need to go to the restroom or anything, just get up and go during. Okay, week 3. Welcome everybody. Welcome everybody at home. Today what we're going to do is have a look at any questions that have come up on the data analysis number 1. Remember that is due Monday 26th. Okay, that's when that is due. And as I said before, you can talk to each other about it. Just make sure that the write-up is entirely your own. We're also going to look at the reading, chapter 4, role of native language up to error analysis. Now this should be a nice little review because we actually talked about this in week 1, right at the very beginning. We talked about how we went from behaviorism to contrastive analysis to error analysis. So that was the reading that you did for this week in chapter 4, and it should have been not too complicated because you already had an idea. True, not true? True, good, thank you. Okay, all right. So let's look at some questions. I had one question from the online group. There were some really nice responses to from the online group and from you guys on the thread, which I've responded to. But there was one very specific question from Shannon about the data, and then I think Mark also might have some questions in here. So let's address both of those. If you're at home, you might want to find your data analysis set so that you can follow along, and I will find mine, so that you can follow along with the questions. And you guys have yours, right? Yeah, with you? Okay, good. All right, so you might want to follow along too.
We can't see their discussion board for the online section.
No, you can't. And that's why, so far, the only question that's come up is this one from Shannon.
Okay.
If another question comes up, and vice versa, that I answer that specifically got to do with the data analysis, Sheehan and I will make sure that it's swapped from one to the other one. All right, so let's start with Shannon's question. I'm just going to flip this over. Document cat. Okay, great. Can you see that, guys? Sort of? Okay, good. All right, so this is the first data set, and I'm going to flip over again to Shannon's question. So Shannon says, the data from part 1, which is the Japanese girl, I was wondering how we would know if something is English-like or non-English-like. For example, in month 4, what do you do is grammatically correct, but it appears that the speaker was trying to use the present continuous, what are you doing? I know we cannot assume anything, so this is where my question lies. So in this case, this is my answer that's underlined. It's a clear and warranted assumption based on the previous and following data. The only other possibility would be a very unlikely complex construction to do with what do you do if, the dog runs into the middle of the street or something. So this is very unlikely, right? Basically, you've been given a data set, and the data set, you've got, how do you know, do you have coffee, what do you want, what do you doing, what do you do it, this froggy, what do you doing, what do you do? Okay, so it's a sort of clear and warranted assumption that this must be the same kind of problem, right? We don't want to automatically just suddenly say, oh, they've gone off in another world, especially as this is a little kid. They've gone off in another world in which they're asking what you do for a job or what you do if something happens. And part of the reason that you know that for this data set is because, as I told you, these data sets were collected for you to do. So you can go by what assumption makes sense, right? And in this case, that what do you do makes sense as what are you doing. Now, if you really weren't sure, you could, of course, do what with it? You could make 3 columns and do...
Maybe English like, maybe not.
Yeah, which was the ambiguous column, right? Maybe English like, maybe not English like. But in this case, it's super unlikely, right? I mean, it's in a pattern of constructions that form a very clear pattern for you. All right. Then she says, another example can be seen on month 6. Do you put it? Grammatically, it is correct, but it doesn't make any sense. But of course, grammatically, this isn't correct either, right? So, yeah, no one would ever say, do you put it? So that one. Now, I will say, though, that once you get involved with these data analysis, you do start seeing squirrely. So it's best to kind of walk away and come back, because sometimes you're like, wait, is that grammatical or is that ungrammatical? So, you know, sort of do the ones that are clear to you. And then if something you're struggling over, then sort of put it to side for a bit, or go ask your husband or your wife or your dog or your cat or your, you know. Okay. And that one, by the way, was here at month 6. Do you bought this too? Do you put it? Do you put it? How do you put it? How do you put it? How do you put it? Okay. All right. Let's go back. So this is the end of Shannon's excellent question. How do you categorize data when you aren't sure what the speaker is trying to say? So you can make warranted assumptions about the meaning of the sentences. In this case, because the data has been collected for you, so you can follow the likely patterns. In the case of your own data collection, if you did any, it would be again by the general context of the utterances. Don't assume that they randomly mean something that has nothing to do with what the rest of their utterances look like, is my point. If you can warrant the assumption, which is what Shannon did when she said, I assume what he's saying is, what is he doing? It's an entirely warranted assumption. If you can do that, do that. If you really are struggling with it and you can't make a warranted assumption, then, and you're really not sure, then you can always put it in the ambiguous column. What you don't want to do is start putting everything and its mother in the ambiguous column, because then you're not going to end up with any real data set analysis. Okay, so we're only talking about the odd one here and there. We're not talking about a whole chunk of data should go in the ambiguous column. Okay. Thank you, Shannon. That was an excellent question. Any questions here about Shannon's question? No? Okay. All right. Now, Mark, you said that you had taken a look at speaker number 2, which is the Norwegian speaker. Wait. Oh, yeah, it's here. So this would be our Norwegian boy here. He's also a child. This is spontaneous speech and translation from 6 years, 6 months to 6 years, 8 months. All right. You have some linguistic background. So the first thing I would say is that they've given you an example of each question type in Norwegian. So they've given you an example of a do you question, right? And what's the first thing you can tell about Norwegian versus English based on the translation of that do question? What's the first thing you can see? Huh?
The translation of did you do it?
Yes. So if you look at the Norwegian version of did you do it, what's the first thing that you notice comparing the Norwegian structure to the English structure?
The base form of the verb is missing.
Good. Not the auxiliary form, right? So in the English, you have auxiliary plus main verb, right? And in the past tense specifically, the past tense falls on the auxiliary, right? The first thing that you notice with the Norwegian is that there is no auxiliary, right? The verb, there's only one verb in the sentence, and that carries the past tense, okay? So that's the first thing. So that would be one sort of note to self, right? When I look at the do questions, if there was first language transfer, what would we expect when we looked at the do questions? If this kid was transferring Norwegian into English for the do questions, what would we expect?
There would be no do.
Good. There would be no auxiliary, right? There would just be the one verb. Is that, in fact, what happens? Right. Now, there's some futzing going on in time 3 at the beginning that you can look at, but basically, if you look at the examples in time 4, right, he's not just transferring the L1, okay? Now, that's one really important, I mean, I've basically just given you the answer to one of the questions, but that's one really important aspect in which we can't just assume the transfer is happening, right? So whatever the problems he might have with grammar, this ain't one of them. He seems to have quite happily established that there needs to be 2 verbs, the did and the main verb, right? So remember what I said last week, if they've put something here, they've put it here for a reason. They want you to look at it and then compare it to the data and say, what's meaningful about this? In this particular case, a big hint, the meaningfulness is, at least by the end, first language transfer has nothing to do with it, okay, because he's not doing what he does in Norwegian. Now, the next one they give you, because they have a bunch of examples of the other question form we have in English, which is the WH form, right? And the WH form of questions in English means anything that has a WH. So where, why, what, when, but it also includes how. Okay, how is also a WH question. It just is how, right? So all the WHs plus how. Now, let's have another look. What happens in Norwegian with a WH question?
There's no auxiliary, so you would just take the verb and the object and you switch them.
Good. There's no auxiliary again, right? There's no did he say, right? So in this case, you've only got the main verb that carries the past tense. Okay. What else is different?
There's no inversion.
Good. Thank you. There's no inversion. So that's nothing like English. So again, you're looking for that. You're looking at that to see in what ways does this maybe affect or not affect the data that he's producing. All right. Now, I said to Tolu, and I should have said it out loud to everybody last week, if you're not sure about some of these structures, look it up. You know, you're not supposed to know. I mean, these are very straightforward grammar structures that you are supposed to know by this point. You're supposed to know how questions work in English, and you're supposed to know how negatives work in English, and you're supposed to know how basic tenses work in English. But okay, let's say that you've forgotten or you're not sure. No problem. Go to a grammar book and look it up, or look it up online, okay? Or buy yourself a good grammar book so you can look it up, so that you can give yourself a good baseline understanding of how questions are constructed in English, and then you can look at this too. Because if there's problems in his question structure with, for example, these did questions, right? Well, we know that there's no auxiliary, but if that's not the problem, if it's another kind of problem that might not be related to the fact that there's no auxiliary, then you want to look at the rest of the construction. Let me give you an example. Let me give you an example from the Japanese. If we look at the Japanese time 2, and you look at the Japanese time 1. Look at the Japanese time 1. Again, I'm giving you an answer here to help you sort of work out what's going on. Look at month 1. There are 2 types of questions there, right? What are the 2 types of questions shown in month 1? Huh?
It's a WH question.
Good. What's the WH question, Diego?
How do you do it?
How. Good. How. How do you do it? So how do you do it? Now let's look at time 2. Now you've got a whole bunch of WH questions. Look at what's happening in the first 2. Particularly look at the second one. And the first one, actually. Compare the structure in month 1 to the first 2 WH structures in month 2. Let's break it down. What's happening in the WH structure in month 1? Looks perfectly fine,
Yeah, it's
right?
fine.
Yeah, okay. So then talk to me about that structure. The first thing is the WH word. Then what happens?
Do you?
Yeah, which is what? Auxiliary plus
Plus
pronoun. Then what?
verb object.
Verb object. Good. Perfect. So you've got WH word, auxiliary plus pronoun plus main verb plus object, right? Now let's have a look in time 2. Tell me what's going on in this one.
She's doing the same thing, but she's making a mistake because she doesn't understand that to use the present progressive, you've got to stick form to be in.
Okay, that's one problem. Good. That's one problem. One problem is she doesn't understand that it's a to be auxiliary, not a do auxiliary. So right now she's just sticking WH word plus do together. Boom, 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 boom. She has yet to learn the tragedy that is English, that doesn't work the same way all the time. She needs to maybe use a be or a can or something else. Okay, good. Can you see anything else? There's one other thing I want you to spot, if you can.
She's got it and this for showing.
Good. The other thing, this is brilliant. So you've done it. So can you see, you have to just keep, oh, I just did something. I hit my head that time. You have to keep looking and take it word by word. That's exactly what's happening, Diego. If you look, for example, at what do you do it this froggy? Okay, she's got WH word, auxiliary, pronoun, main verb, object, then more objects, right? Because what do you think is happening?
She's putting the person or thing she's addressing at the end of the sentence.
Right, because where does it belong?
Yeah.
Right, at the beginning. But twice she's doing it at the end, right? This boy and this frog. So what might be happening? She's already fitted something into the object slot, right? What has she fitted in there? What's gone into the object slot? It, right? You see that? So how do you do it? So what do you do it, this froggy, right? She's lost the spot because she thinks, it looks like she thinks that you have to have WH, auxiliary do, pronoun, main verb, it, and then anything else. What she actually wants to know is how's the froggy, right? Anything else she just sticks at the end because she's run out of slots to put it into. Do you see? So those are the two, so that is actually the two really tricky things in her data. I've just given them to you and you're very welcome. But that's the kind of analysis that you want to be doing, okay? Looking at it and saying, how do these slots, how are they changing these slots or not changing these slots? What looks like it's a template, if you like. This chick clearly has a template that certainly originally she is following, right? And the template looks like it's made up of WH do you, right? Because if you have to put in what does Froggy do, there's nowhere to put Froggy because you is in there already, okay? Yes? No? Maybe so? Now, is there a point at which she breaks the WH plus do plus you? Remember, now you're only looking at WH questions.
Well, she learns before that did is past tense.
Right, but does she break that problem with the WH plus do or did plus you? One time. Can anyone see where it is? On this first page. I hadn't looked at the second page. One time on this first page, she breaks it. And only one time. If you consider WH questions are anything WH plus how, she breaks that pattern only one time. Keep looking. This is why you need to write them down, by the way, and put them in tables so that you can see properly. You're not just looking at sort of randomly. Go down the past tense and tell me where she breaks that pattern.
What did she?
Good. Yes. What did she say? One and only time she breaks that pattern. Okay. And she can't do it, you know. And what is interesting about that breaking? What is she? What is she? What's the word she? What's its grammatical category? Good, it's a pronoun, Diego. It's so interesting because on the one hand, you want to look carefully and do it. On the other hand, you don't want to make it too complicated, right? So in this case, she breaks the pattern one time. She breaks the pattern with another pronoun. So that sort of makes sense, right? Because how did you, how did she, how did he, that sort of makes sense. If she tries to break the pattern with a noun, so boy, frog, she can't do it, right? She sticks boy and frog at the end. Because she keeps her how do you or how did you. So that's her slot for the you. She's got a slot at the end with it. So then they just put froggy right at the tail end. Does that make sense? Okay. So now the questions will help lead you to, so for example, question number 1, consider the way this child forms questions in month 1. What kind of generalization has she made about English questions? And here you're literally just looking at those 4, right? So you would have 2 generalizations. One thing that she seems to be doing with WH questions and one thing with do questions. And your answer in this one, if you're just looking at month 1, would be that it looks like she understands what? Yeah, it looks like she understands all of it. Do you know? Do you have coffee? Do you want this one? How do you do it? These are all perfectly grammatical questions, right? So if you just look at her at month 1, you say, well, my generalization is she can do WH questions perfectly well, and she can do yes, no, do questions perfectly well. Whoopee. Plus, she doesn't seem to have a problem with inversion. So you're like, Great. Then, now consider the child's question at month 2. Is the child using the same generalization as she was at month 1? What additional information do the data at month 2 provide about the interpretation of the data at month 1? Okay, so if you go from month one to month 2, most of them are what in month 2? Correct or incorrect? Incorrect. So the first thing that your generalization from month 1 to month 2 is, oops, my bad. I thought she was brilliant, but it turns out she ain't brilliant. She doesn't know what the hell she's doing, okay? So based on what we said last week, what does that mean that this is likely to be? Like these month 1 generalizations. Not actual grammatical working out, but good whole unanalyzed chunks. Okay, whole unanalyzed cloth, if you like. No, she doesn't actually understand how you break it down, and you have to have an auxiliary, and you have to have a this, you have to have a that. What she's doing is making these chunks, right? Now, that's your hypothesis. In month 2, where it says, is the child using the same generalizations at month 1? Let's take, these are all W8 questions, right? In month 2. So the only one that's important to you is the first one in month 1. So does it look like she's doing the same thing in month 1 and month 2? Basically, at least half of it, yes, because she's got this, how do you do? What do you doing? What do you do? You know, so she's obviously continuing to use, at least for some of these, this unanalyzed pattern. And then she begins to move at the end of month 3. Do you see? Okay, so it's very important when you do this, in order to answer these questions properly, is that you make your table, right? So you do your grammatical, ungrammatical, ambiguous table, and you clearly distinguish between, for example, 3 and 2. Okay, there's a change in 3, right? In 3, she gets it right. Okay, how do you draw that? How do you make, right? I mean, it's ungrammatical, but she understands now that you don't need a do. How do you do? How are you doing? Do you see what I mean? So if you weren't looking at this carefully and you had not made up your tables by time and split them up so you could clearly see time and clearly see data, you might miss this, right? Because it's not distinguished, okay? So what I'm looking for is that you have done that work, that you've carefully distinguished them, put them in tables, and then really thought about in what ways are the structure similar or the structure different, okay? So we've basically done the first couple of questions I mean, there's more that you can say, but essentially we've done the first couple of questions for the Japanese. How are we doing? So remember, this is the first one. By the time you've done this, you'll be doing 3 of these. So I don't expect you to be perfect on the first one, but I do expect you to follow the procedure. If you don't follow the procedure, you will lose the points, okay? I expect to see the table. I expect the table to be written out properly. I expect the questions that you answer. Don't try and answer on this thing. There's not enough space. I expect you to type out the answers properly and give me as much information as you can about your underlying reasoning, okay? What I did do on this PowerPoint was just include at the end what we did. Follow the same basic steps every time, okay? Describe the data. You have those data descriptions now at the top. Categorize the data, okay? Look at fit and exceptions, all right? What more data do you need? And so on, okay? Well, that's the end of it. Categorize, look for patterns. What more data would you need, okay? And those are the kinds of questions, and then you're going to answer the questions on the sheet, but those are exactly the questions, the kind of questions that are on the sheet, right? It just asked you, what can you see about month one, right? That means generalizations and so it's fit and exceptions, right? What can you tell me about what looks similar and what looks different, okay? And if it asks you specifically about transfer, then you can use the transfer information that it's given you and the top here, okay? If it doesn't ask you specifically about transfer, don't just write, well, maybe it's transfer, right? Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Okay, that's not a particularly helpful answer, right? They've given you what you need to know about the language. We don't want to just assume it's transfer. In fact, in many of these cases, as you'll see on the data, it is not first language transfer. So, and that's why they've given you the grammar. So you're really trying to work out the developmental stage that he or she might be at. Any questions? So I anticipate that there will be questions as you start working on this. I can't emphasize enough that you should not wait until Sunday night, the 25th, to start working on this, because it'll drive you crazy. I expect to see questions, and I'll be looking every day for them. If questions come up in the classroom thread, Sheehan or me will transfer them with my answers into the online thread and vice versa. We'll be looking at it every day to do that, so that if you have, I liked the fact you can email me anytime. That's fine. That's what I'm here for. I like the fact that Shannon put the questions up in Virtual Office, because if she's got the question, someone else has got the question, right? Because there's 24 of you. So it's easier for me, I mean, you know, and more productive for you if you write these questions up in Virtual Office. Please don't, I'm not about to like tell you that there's an unutterably stupid question in front of all your colleagues. I won't do that. I will answer your question for you, okay? But it's helpful for everybody else, okay? All righty? All righty. Okay, then in that case, let's go on for the rest of today, which is your reading chapter 4, which, as I say, is going to be a little more in depth, but should have been a nice review based on what we did. All right, so we're going to start with this idea of, so this whole chapter is about the role of the native language, okay? In other words, remember what we said, we're not talking about simultaneous bilinguals here. We're not talking about children that learn 2 languages from birth. We're talking about people who learn a second language. Like these children in these problem sets are only 6, 7 years old, but by that point, the architecture of their first language is in place, okay? So that's why we can look at their data and say what's happening as they learn English, because they already have their first language in place. So what is the role of the native language, okay? And originally what people thought was this very straightforward behaviorism paradigm. Child hears dull, repeats dull, gets dull, basically, right? Or sorry, that's not very American. Child hears dull. How do you say it? Dull. Child hears dull, repeats dull, gets dull. Okay. Yeah, right. Dull. I was thinking. My favorite Indian food. If the repetition, the response, okay, so if when she repeats dull, is too far away from the pronunciation of dull, the stimulus, the child doesn't get the dull. That's essentially what this is about, okay? That the child wants something, understands what the stimulus is, repeats it, and if it's close enough, gets what it wants, okay? That's the sort of underlying idea of how the language is created. With this, thus, when we talk about second language learning, comes the idea of transfer, right? If this is how you do it in your first language, if you try and do the same thing in your second language, you transfer those habits that you formed, okay? So basically, they can either be helpful, positive habits, unhelpful, negative habits. They can interfere with your learning of the second language, so negative, or they can facilitate your second language, so positive, okay? So this drove very early attempts at contrastive analysis, right? Now, we already know from everything we've just done, even today, in the first part of this data analysis, that that's way too simple, right? Because if that very simplistic idea of transfer had was happening, you wouldn't have that issue with a Norwegian boy, right? That Norwegian boy would not have used, there would be no reason for him to put in an auxiliary. There's no auxiliary in Norwegian, right? So why would he do it? So we already can see, and that's what a lot of these data sets are really sort of showing you, that kind of very simplified idea of contrastive analysis doesn't get you very far. And you can have a look at those tenets of the original contrastive analysis on page 86, okay? That contrastive analysis is based on the idea that language is habit. Major source of error in the production of L2 is the native language. You can account for errors by considering differences between the L1 and the L2. The more differences, the more errors, okay? So we already know that that is too simplified, but that was the 1950s idea of what would happen. That's the strong view, right? So that's the strong view of contrastive analysis, okay? But there are some problems with that, right? We've already seen some of the problems looking at the data analysis, but here they are again. How do we explain errors that L2 learners make that are the same as L1 initial errors? For example, a classic child L1 English error is to try and regularize irregular tenses, right? So instead of saying she came, they've learned that a regular past tense ending is what? What's a regular past tense ending? ED, good. So what they try and do is regularize that verb. So instead of saying she came, they say she can't, right? It's also a classic first language English learning child error to say she goed, right? For the same reason, because they're trying to regularize that verb go. So they don't want to say the irregular past tense, which is went, right? So instead she uses goed, right? Now, L2 learners will make also that same error, regardless of what their first language does. Regardless of whether their first language regularizes all their verbs or not, they will make that same error. Okay. So in other words, there are errors that little L1 English kids make and big L2 English learners make that are the same error, which suggests that they are not coming from big L2 learners' native language, right? The second issue is, how do we explain errors that do not occur when we would expect them to occur? And there was an example in your book, I think, from French, which is has a I, them, see structure. So is it French? Yeah, je les vois, okay, which means I see them, right? So in French, it's je les vois, I, them, see. So you would expect French learners of English to say, I, them, see, right? Which we've marked here with a star, which is how we mark ungrammatical structures, okay, with this little star. But in fact, French learners don't say I, them, see. They seem to very easily learn that it is I see them. Okay, this does not seem to be a problem. Okay, so not only do we get some similar errors between first language learners of English and second language learners of English, we also get errors. We get places where if you were just doing a straight up contrastive analysis, you would expect a certain error, and that does not appear. Okay. There's also the problem that this assumes that all languages are like French and English. And you can say, you know, for every structure or function that's in English, you can find the same structure or function in the second language and vice versa, right? It assumes that something like je les vois can be transcribed exactly the same in English. Now, happily, yes, between French and English it can. But between many languages and English, this is not true, right? There are many structures that appear in English that do not appear in other languages and vice versa, okay? So in this case, you had a nice, easy one. But what do you do when you've got languages that don't necessarily have a one-to-one correspondence? Okay, they don't look like this. Okay, the way the form works in one language is not the same way that the form or function works in the second language. It's going to be another problem, right? Because you don't really know what's going to happen. You can't predict what's going to happen if the structure doesn't even appear in the first language. So this is called a hierarchy of difficulty, and the idea is to try and test which are the real problem ones. So the hierarchy of difficulty just lists the possibility. The least problematic is what we call a correspondence form, right? So a form or function that is largely similar between both languages. Okay, that's what we saw with je les vois. Okay, I see them, I them see. Right, that's a perfect correspondence. What changes is the word order, but in every other way, it's three separate forms. They do exactly the same thing: two pronouns and a verb, and we're hunky dory, right? But then there's these other possibilities The first is called differentiation. Native language has one form, target language has two. And I think this is also true in Spanish, no? Isn't it in Spanish there's ser, to know, or be, or something? What is it, Diego?
It's to be, so.
To be, but isn't there another to be? Estar?
Yeah.
Okay, okay. So what's the difference between?
One is to be, what do they mean? Yeah, like a state of being is considered different.
A state of being is considered different than
Like who you are.
who you are, right? So in that case, that would be a classic differentiation problem. Like in English, we just are, right? But in Spanish, you've got to pick which one you want. Same with Italian. The example in the book was with Italian, but it was with the verb no. Coalescing is the opposite problem. The native language has two forms. Wait. Yes, the native language has two forms and the target language has one. Okay, so that would be the exact same thing. So a Spanish coming over to learn English would learn that be covers estar and ser, right? Okay. Then the third one, which is in some ways considered to be the most tricky, is a new category, right? So the native language has no category that matches this, and the target language has a category, okay? In this case, the article system in English, okay? And for example, a language that doesn't have an article system. But think of something more complicated, like the difference between German and English, right? The German has an article system, but there are three articles, right? Der, die, and das, okay? So you have a category, but it operates differently from one language to the other. Does that make sense? So when you start thinking about all the different ways in which language X can vary from language Y, you see why contrastive analysis just in its simplistic form doesn't work, right? Because it's too complicated. Lado himself, who was the guy that did this, said, this is an empirical question, meaning if contrastive analysis is true, we should be able to see it in our students' errors, right? And he said, let's go ahead and do this. And when they did this, it turned out it didn't work very well. Okay, and he was fine about it. He always said, like, well, it's empirical. We can theorize this, but then we've got to see if these errors are errors learners actually make. So this is where we shifted into looking at learner language itself, rather than looking theoretically at the difference between L1 and L2. Okay, but actually looking at what the learners themselves were doing with it. And the question was, what errors are learners making consistently in production, and what ways can they be tied to either their first language or the structural components of the second language, right? Is there a way that they can be tied either way? So an example of that would be, can you tie an error to a first language transfer situation, so to the L1? Or can you tie an error to the way in which language structure operates in the L2, regardless of the L1, okay? Or even irregardless of the L1, as Sal would say. Or even unirregardless of the L1, which is what Sal always says. And the idea is that this journey, and this is what we talked about in week 1, this journey is not a random one, right? It's not just a series of hiccups, as they said in your book, between L1 and L2. You're sort of randomly floating around, and then someday you have some kind of variant of L2 that sounds pretty good, okay? But that in fact, this can be charted systematically, right? So first, the very first thing, and this came up in your feed, and I was really interested in your feed, and a couple of people said that, you know, the way they do it is to note down the errors. The way they do language analysis is informal. So they do it, but it's a more informal process in which they might, particularly in speech, might note down errors. And this is where it's very important. It's also important in writing, but it's particularly important in speaking to distinguish between a mistake and an error, right? So a mistake, okay, let me back up. A mistake is a mistake in production. Like you just sort of spoke wrongly. You know, you said something. It doesn't actually say anything about your competence. A lot of us do it a lot of the time, right? Native speakers do it all the time. They say something and then they realize that they've said something completely ungrammatical, or, you know, there's some problem. And so they just correct themselves. That's a mistake. They understand that that's not the system, right? An error is a mistake that actually is systematic. That means that your underlying transitional grammar has some systematic gaps in it, okay? So how do you think you can start to distinguish between an error and a mistake?
Consistency.
Good. One is consistency. So you don't want to just start randomly writing down errors that your learners make, right? You want to try and find the errors that are consistent, because they're the ones that are going to tell you that there's a problem with their underlying understanding of the system, not that they're just having a particularly bad day that day because they only got 2 hours of sleep, right? And one of the ways to do that is to do the kind of analysis that you look at here, where you just take a particular form and you look at the development of that form and see if it's consistently variable in some way, rather than sometimes they get it completely right and sometimes they get it, you know, there's a problem with the way that they're producing it. So it's very important to make that, because as teachers, we're not interested in correcting every mistake. We don't have time to correct every mistake. What we're interested in doing is help our student develop errors in their system, all right, and pushing those forward. So once we've distinguished an error and a mistake, and say we're going to focus on errors, not on mistakes, then you can decide. It's really one of three. So someone else wrote in their feed, well, if it's not a transfer error, what is it? You know, if it's not an L1 transfer error. And basically we sort of recognize, remember we said about 30, 30, 30, we recognize 3 places that error can come from. One is the classic L1 transfer error, okay, the one that you immediately think of. That's called an interlingual error. It's the idea that you're going from one language to another, you're bringing your first language with you, and you're transferring some form from your first language, okay? But there's also what we call interlingual errors. These are errors that derive from the forms and functions of the target language, so in this case of English, regardless of your native language, okay? Or even irregardless. So this is the kind of thing that we're seeing in our first data analysis, right? Okay, that's all right. Sorry everybody, we're really struggling and it's all my fault. There's still no PowerPoint. Anyway, we're still looking at the same PowerPoint slide. Developmental in some other form. Oh, is that back? No, but still no PowerPoint. Okay. A combination of factors. All right. Oh, God. Okay. So issues in error analysis. Error analysis.
This is an error because of the system we're in. It's not.
This is a systematic error caused by yours truly, who keeps hitting the button with her knee. I'm so sorry. All right. This slide is called Issues in Error Analysis, and this is some of the problems. Okay, error analysis, just like contrastive analysis, is not the be all and end all, right? There are problems with error analysis, and this is the part that is also in your book. So under issues with error analysis, we have something called avoidance, right? Which is where learners avoid structures they're unclear of, okay? Rather than use them, they just don't use them. So an error analysis won't tell you if they can use them or not because they deliberately don't use them. So you have no idea. So if you have avoidance errors, the only way that you can deal with avoidance errors is to test learners on a particular structure and then see. But if you're just looking at their spontaneous speech or their spontaneous writing, they may just simply not use that form. It can be difficult to identify exactly where an error is coming from, right? Whether it is, I mean, the easiest ones are the transfer ones, but if it's an intralingual one or some other combination of developmental factors, it's tricky. So just because we can see a consistent error doesn't necessarily mean we can exactly identify where it comes from, which is one thing that you're doing with your data analyses, right? With your data analyses, you're saying, I see that there's a consistent error. I'm speculating. My warranted speculation is that it looks like first language transfer or it doesn't look like first language transfer, okay? Correct production doesn't necessarily reflect correct rule formation. What do I mean by that? Think of the Japanese girl in month 1 and month 2. In month 1, her question structure, her production was 100% correct, exactly. So if you just looked at month 1, you'd say, wow, that chick's got that down, right? But when you go to number 2, you see that her rule formation is not correct, okay? She's using templates or she's using unanalyzed chunks of language. Clearly, she does not understand how the rule works, okay? So in other words, you have to look at many instances of production in order to get an idea. If you look on page 97, you will see the, yeah, don't worry. If you look at the thing on page 97, you'll see data very similar to what we looked at in class last week, where we had a look at stages of development, okay? And in this case, this is Schumann's idea of know, understand versus don't like versus not today. And it turns out that a lot of language learners go through this particular, it's not just learners from Spanish, for example, who say no, understand. A bunch of learners do, all right? So this is some kind of potential developmental sequence as they learn the language. All right, and that is basically the end. I want you to briefly take a look at the summary on page 99, the 3 of you that are here, and make sure that you can check each of those points to remember. If there's one that doesn't make sense to you, speak now.
Which page are you on? I'm sorry.
99, Mark.
The hierarchy of difficulty
Mm-hmm.
lets me know these terms. Does it mean
Differentiation.
Yeah, it just means, yeah, it means sort of which errors are, there's a sort of hierarchy of which errors are going to be more or less complicated. The most complicated being some kind of differentiation or new category, and the least being correspondence, yeah, which is where the forms are the same. Yeah? All right. Okay, so the last slide in the PowerPoint, oh, you guys can't see it either now. Oops, my bad. Okay, is your reading post for week 3. Okay, so those of you that are in class now, you can just see that on the last slide. You've already uploaded the PowerPoint, yeah, into your computer. So the reading post for week 3 this week is actually a reading post, not a discussion post, meaning you do it independently and you drop it in the Dropbox. Okay, there's no discussion open for you. All right, and you're going to complete exercises number 6 and 7 on page 101 in your chapter. Exercises 6 and 7 on page 101. So exercise 6 is a little mini grammar one. Now you're going to be so good at those. And exercise 7 is another discussion. Have you discuss a little bit about errors, okay? Quite a lot of work for this week, talking about the errors and the, doing your data analysis for next week. Just let me know if you've got any questions. Shihan and I will transfer them backwards and forwards if we get good questions and good answers, okay? So assume that if you don't see anything, no one's asked that question, thus you should ask it if you have it, okay? Okay? All right. Thank you very much, everybody. My apologies.